Hello, everyone. Just wanted to make a video about this week's reading by Peter Singer. Just keep in mind that the two essays are part of one PDF document. You only have to read the Singer for this week, and then the response by Arthur, I believe his name is for next week. So we're just looking at this one essay this week by Peter Singer, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Looks like it's a pretty sketchy photocopy, but you know, you do what you can to find these texts on the internet. This is, we've been introduced to this general subject, I hope, to some degree by the hypothetical that I gave you last week involving Jane and the lost child. Just a way to get into it. Here we have a much more developed idea, not particularly about our obligations, such as they are to children, but including children. Really, nothing in the argument has anything particular to do with children, but children are front and center. This is a very famous essay that Singer published in the early 70s, and that's why the reference in the beginning to what's happening in what he calls East Bengal, I think that's Bangladesh, modern country of Bangladesh, is something that he's talking about. It was a big humanitarian issue of the time, a big humanitarian crisis, which he uses as a jumping off point for an argument that has nothing particularly to do with that crisis. But you'll see that, it's about what our obligations are. And he is proceeding in a very sort of methodical way. You see on here, the second page, page 836, I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. So he's got an argument here, right? And what he's trying to do is say, well, if you accept my premises and certain conclusions actually do follow from my premises, then you must accept my conclusions as well. That's the way that Peter Singer really proceeds, I think, generally in a very methodical way, presenting arguments. I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. We can all agree with that. He says, I think most people will agree about this, although one may reach the same view by different routes. I shall not argue for this view. But it's just, he's taking it as a given. People can hold all sorts of eccentric positions, and perhaps from some of them, it would not follow that death by starvation is in itself bad. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to refute such positions, and so for brevity, I will henceforth take this assumption as accepted. Those who disagree need read no further. It's just sort of reaching out and saying, we all, most of us, unless you're really eccentric, would accept that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad things. And then, proceeding with the argument, he says, my next point is this. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it, which is the second premise, right? That is, if we recognize that something is bad and we can prevent it from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we should do it, which is a less obvious thing than saying that this kind of needless suffering this suffering is bad. But perhaps something that most of us would also agree upon. That is, if we recognize that something is bad and can prevent it from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable importance on our own, then we should. He continues and says, by without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, I mean without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good comparable in significance to the bad that we can prevent. Then follows his very famous hypothetical, right? Here on the top of, page 837. An application of this principle would be as follows. Sorry, it's really pretty small, isn't it? right here. An application of this principle would be as follows. If I am walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. And it's a very strong sort of, example that all of us would say minimal decency would require that we help the child at the cost of getting our clothes muddy. So there's the argument. I mean, I think, that, we all consider suffering and death from lack of resources to be bad. We all believe that if we can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing on our own behalf anything of comparable moral importance, then we should. And that an example of this would be if we saw a child drowning in a shallow pond, that we would wade in and save the child, even though we would get our clothes muddy, because getting your clothes muddy is not something of comparable moral importance than somebody drowning. But then he hits you with it, right? And says here, the uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive if it were acted upon. Even in its qualified form, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. And then the rest of the essay is just really going into the details of the implication of it, which is that all of us are in the position analogous to walking by a child drowning in a shallow pond. It's called world hunger, starvation, children and other people dying because of lack of resources. And we could do something about it. We could donate to charities, reputable charities, effective charities, that could prevent these things from happening. I mean, it could alleviate this suffering, and most of us don't. And that's why he says that our world would be fundamentally changed if we just acted on the principle that he set out or followed the implications of the argument that he set out. We would give to charity. And then the question, of course, becomes to what extent we would have, what extent our responsibilities to give would actually be. Even if we each gave kind of an insignificant amount relative to our own needs, then there would be a fundamental change. But the real moral duty that's pointed out is that we should probably give according to the principle. That is, you should keep giving until you reach the point where you're at the point of sacrificing something of similar moral importance. For instance, if we have extra money, what should we do with that money? Should we spend it on luxury goods? Should we spend it on entertainment, things we don't really need? Or should we give it to charities that would ensure that people who don't have the basic resources to live could live? Well, we should give until we ourselves would be so impoverished that we would be lacking those things, I think is the argument. A lot of important points here, like the bottom of page 839. He says, if my argument so far has been sound, neither our distance from a preventable evil nor the number of other people who, in respect to the evil, are in the same situation as we are, lessens our obligation to mitigate or prevent that evil. It sort of came up in our discussion of the Jane scenario. That is, Jane is amongst a crowd of people, all of whom could help this child. When she gets on the bus, she may be relying on those other people to help that child, but does that lessen her own obligation? Just because other people are in a position to help, does that lessen her own obligation to do something and help? Similar point. Anyway, the basic, you can see what the basic idea is here. And really, a lot of this is taken up in the practicalities of it. And also, again, that issue of once we've established this moral obligation, Singer thinks, by sheer consistency, if we accept the premises of his argument, how far do we have to go in terms of sacrifices that we would need to make to fulfill that obligation? It's extremely interesting. And I would say, as far as the history of modern, it's hard to call it contemporary now, something written in 1972, but this had a really big effect, and it's really kind of a milestone in terms of thinking about our obligations to people we don't know. That's maybe one of the big things is that just because, the singer says, just because we don't know the people who are in need, or there's a distance between, we don't see them the way that we would see that child, that really makes no difference whatsoever, which is a very contentious point. So just read this essay, stop here, and don't read the Arthur until next week, or you can do whatever you want. But the Arthur in the same PDF is the reading for next week. You don't need to do the study questions. That's just somebody else's stuff.